Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures, a show where my guests and I get to explore entrepreneurial stories, problem spaces, market landscapes, and examine together how new ventures might be able to be created, either for-profit, nonprofit, or personal ventures, to benefit humanity. Really, the purpose of this show is to educate and inspire a new generation of venture builders and venture investors to make the world a better place. In today's episode, we're going to be covering the topics of cholesterol, heart disease, diabetes, biohacking, N=1 experiments, and ways that you can talk with your medical professionals about doing ketogenic diets or at least lowering the amount of carbohydrates that you have in your diet. And that will change your blood work. I mean, I noticed that my cholesterol, specifically my LDL cholesterol, raised significantly when I was ketogenic dieting. And my guest today is Dave Feldman. He noticed the same phenomenon on himself when he noticed that he was entering the world of potential type 2 diabetes. He went on a low-carb, high-fat diet, and a common story, you notice your cholesterol goes up. Well, he took action. He started a series of N=1 experiments and started publishing his data and raising a conversation with the low-carb community about cholesterol. And the way he approaches his understanding of lipidology, immunology, and his desire to follow the data wherever it leads to help develop hypotheses to promote and inspire a generation of researchers to help figure out what's going on here. I really admired the way he goes about it. So I'm honored that he would be on the show. And really, we cover a crash course in lipidology and immunology that is just obviously scratching the surface about how complex these issues are. In fact, at the time of this recording, there's been a number of resources available just this week that I will link to in the show notes that for those of you who are interested in diving in deeper, there is a very deep rabbit hole for you to follow. So I'm excited to introduce you to these topics. And really, in the startup community, we talk about solving problems. Well, heart disease is the #1 killer in the world. And so if you are listening or watching this show, if there's a way for you to potentially help out humanity in one degree or another on this conversation, I hope that this show is inspiring for you to that end. So if you're listening to this show, you can watch it by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes about the different resources and topics that we talk about today. And if you're watching this show, you can listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Dave Feldman. All right, Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited about this conversation because when I first started getting serious about tracking biodata, my own biodata, when I was getting seriously into the ketogenic diet world, I noticed, similar to you and similar to a lot of people that I know that are into this world, that my LDL cholesterol skyrocketed. I freaked out. My doctors freaked out. We were like, is ketogenic dieting safe? And so this is kind of a springboard conversation into a larger conversation around the whole healthcare space in general, how to deal with data, how to run experiment on ourselves, how to work with medical doctors and medical teams toward that end. So I'd love to hear about you, what you're up to, and a little bit of your backstory thus far.
Sure. Well, of course, I am a software engineer. I'm also an entrepreneur. I've spent a lot of time not just developing programs and platforms, but also the businesses that help put them together. And in the course of doing so, that's really been the main focus and interest in my life. It's my career. It's kind of in my DNA, if you will. And what happened was a little over 5 years ago, in March of 2015, I'd gotten some blood work back that showed for the second year in a row that I had an elevated A1C. And A1C is, of course, a marker for diabetes. And I wasn't quite diabetic because my A1C was a 6.1 and they consider you diabetic at about 6.5. But 6.1 was concerning to me because it always been in like the fives, like mid fives and so forth. And at 6.1, you're considered pre-diabetic. And really, they shouldn't even call it pre-diabetic. They should call it stage 1 diabetic because that would get people's attention to start trying to, take steps to make life changes, which is what I started doing. I immediately went to my computer, started hitting the forums. Diabetic forums were talking about this low carb diet as a way of, you know, either reversing it or preventing it from coming about in full. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to try it. I'm going to go ahead and do this low carb diet. And actually, even though I was mainly doing it to just avoid getting type 2 diabetes, which is rampant on my dad's side of the family, I found that I liked all sorts of things about being on a low carb diet. I lost a lot of weight that I wasn't actually even intending to lose. I think my BMI when I started was maybe 25, 26. So it wasn't outrageously, I wasn't, my own wife wouldn't have considered me overweight. But I then became leaner. I became fitter. I started setting personal records on my own running, which was great. And then about 7 months later, I get my blood work, which I fully expected, like so many other people, that it was going to be as stellar as I felt. And indeed, many things improved, except for one thing. One thing really stood out, and that was my cholesterol levels. As you mentioned, especially the LDL cholesterol, LDL being the so-called bad cholesterol. And when that happened, I became actually pretty depressed for a couple weeks. I was very concerned. I thought, how could this amazing diet that makes me feel so great be turning on me and giving me heart disease, and it's going to take me to an early grave? So I started researching everything that I could about the system that moves cholesterol around in our body. And interestingly, I actually started becoming super curious and almost obsessed. It's called lipidology, the study of lipids. Cholesterol is a lipid. So too is the fat that you use for fuel when you're on a low carb, high fat diet. Like if you're using fat, that is itself a lipid. And when I started learning about this system that moves it around, I was like, holy cow, this is a network. I work on networks. Right. It's a distributed object network. In fact, it's mainly distributing fuel, your fat-based fuel for energy, but it does all sorts of other things as well. And that's how the love affair began.
Yeah, that's amazing. So from an education standpoint, my understanding is that all things lipidology essentially come down to there are certain molecules like cholesterol, certain fat-soluble vitamins, different minerals, lipids themselves that need to be transported around the body in order to deliver fuel and vitamins, et cetera, et cetera. And these lipoproteins is what they're called, come in lots of different shapes and sizes. You want to just maybe talk a little bit about the landscape of lipidology a little bit to educate the audience?
Yeah, so it's really pretty simple once you understand the basics. And the basics are this. If you've got something like sugar can be broken into glucose, and glucose can just be placed right into the bloodstream by your body. The reason is because it's soluble. And you can test this at home right now. You can put sugar into your coffee, into water, and you'll find it just distributes out because chemically it's soluble. It mixes well with water. It's what you would call hydrophilic, as in hydro, water, philic, loving. And so, boom, it hugs those water molecules, therefore it can move with the water, just like in your bloodstream, it can move with your blood. Lipids, however, are hydrophobic, which is to say that they're water-fearing or water-avoiding. And just like right now, if you try to take some butter, put that into your coffee. Of course, with coffee, it's a little bit of a different story because you've got other factors. But try mixing butter with water, like room temperature water, or oil with water. You already know what's going to happen. They clump together. They seem to avoid the water and so forth. Well, this is a bit of a problem because your body actually needs these lipids, not just fat for fuel, but as you were alluding to, there are fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. They're all lipids. They don't mix well in the bloodstream. So the genius of your body is it makes something to carry them in the bloodstream that is water soluble. And there's really two main things. They're both proteins. One is something called albumin, which we probably won't talk about a lot, but that picks up the free lipids that are in the bloodstreams. So if your fat cells release some fat into the bloodstream, albumin is a prominent protein that's like a life raft. It'll connect to that life raft and then it can get moved around in it. But the one we're especially interested are called lipoproteins, lipid carrying proteins. And they're really kind of like a boat. If albumin was the life raft, lipoproteins is like a giant tanker. And again, the genius of the body is it doesn't just pick and choose different tankers for each kind of lipid. It puts them all into these lipoproteins. So if right now you have a fatty meal and it included the following, it included triglycerides, which are fat-based fuel, and included fat-soluble vitamins, and it included cholesterol, your body will make a boat in your gut called the chylomicron. It's a lipoprotein, and put them all in that boat, really lots of boats, and can put it right into your bloodstream and it'll move just like the glucose does because it's water soluble. And then, I won't get into it too much, but the cells that need the stuff that's in those boats, they have a process through something called receptors where they can kind of dock those boats and take things that they need off of it. It gets a bit complicated there, but where this becomes relevant to me is that I hypothesized early on, based on a few tests that I did, that if you're on a low-carb diet and you're powered by fat, then this should make a difference as to why your LDL cholesterol is higher, because LDL stands for low-density lipoprotein. And cholesterol is riding in that same lipoprotein boat that your fat-based fuel is riding in. They're ride sharing. It's like Uber, right? And so if my body is making use of these boats to supply my tissues with this fat-based energy, it makes a lot of sense as to why my cholesterol levels would get impacted because they're in the same boats.
Yeah, that's right. So you get your test back. I'm assuming a standard lipid panel. So you got your HDL-C, your LDL-C, trigs. Do you want to talk a little bit about even just what is a basic lipid panel and what does that mean?
Yeah, you basically summarized it. It's really four numbers. It's total cholesterol, which is it's basically all the cholesterol found in lipoproteins for a given unit of blood. There's LDL cholesterol, which for a mnemonic, lots of people will say the L stands for lousy because it's the so-called bad cholesterol. There's HDL cholesterol, which the mnemonic is H for happy, as in if your HDL cholesterol is high, it's usually a good thing. And then lastly, there's triglycerides. Triglycerides is literally the fat itself. It's a measurement of fat for a given unit of blood. Now, you and I, we've seen our LDL cholesterol climb going on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And that was one of the first things I wanted to check into. Why is that? Why would that happen? And even just from having the basic lipid panel, I was able to find that indeed, as I actually brought down the amount of calories I ate, and that includes saturated fat, that surprisingly, my cholesterol levels went up, not down. You'd think that they would go down because I'm eating less saturated fat. I'm eating less food overall. But no, they went up. And then conversely, if I ate a lot of fat, a lot of saturated fat, I would find that my cholesterol levels went down. My total and my LDL cholesterol levels would go down from overeating a lot of fat. And what it turns out to be, and I'm just going to get a tiny bit complicated here, but hopefully everyone's following me thus far, is there's really two places where these boats are made. One is in the gut, your intestine, from food you just ate. Those are the chylomicrons I just mentioned. But just think of them as your gut boats, right? Mm-hmm. The other is in the liver. And those are VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins. There's really just those two places where the boats are made. And why this is important is because the chylomicrons coming from your gut, they drop off their fat-based energy and are very quickly absorbed by the liver. So they don't hang out for very long. But conversely, the boats that are made by your liver, the VLDLs, when they drop off their fat-based energy, about half of them remain in a very famous lipoprotein, the low-density lipoprotein. So they remodel from a VLDL to an LDL. And therefore, that cargo of cholesterol that's in the LDL gets detected and then raises alarm bells. People go, oh, well, there's more LDL in this case. Well, this is what makes sense, that inversion pattern I was talking about. It's inverted from how much I'm eating. If I'm eating a lot of fat, then that's a lot of chylomicrons coming in. My body wisely says, oh, well, we already have a lot of chylomicrons coming in that's carrying fat-based energy. Therefore, we don't need to have as much coming from the liver from storage. But conversely, if I'm fasting, or if I'm eating less and less fat, well, then guess what? My body starts to release more fat from my fat cells, and my liver packages a lot of those fatty acids into triglycerides, puts them on board these VLDLs, and drops off and remodels to LDLs, therefore leaving there being more LDL. And that's why there's now a lot of people who've done this version of my experiment, which colloquially is called the Feldman protocol, where coming up to a blood test, they'll test this by actually over-consuming a lot of fat, actually eating a huge amount of fat for 3 days, and their LDL cholesterol will tend to plummet. It's about an 85% success rate, roughly.
And so from an engineering perspective, first of all, I love approaching biology and biochemistry from an engineering and systems perspective. What would be the purpose of having the LDLs stick around for a while, right? The VLDLs deliver the cargo. Are the LDLs still delivering cargo, or what's up with the actual life of an LDL once it's been remodeled from a VLDL?
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this was one of the frustrating things that for the longest time I had the same impression everybody else did, which is that LDL is, as some would even call it in the literature, a waste product. What's the value of having LDL that sticks around 2 to 4 days in your bloodstream if it serves no purpose? As it turns out, it actually serves many purposes. For one, it's a very integral part of the immune response. So let me give you an example. One of the fat-soluble vitamins I mentioned is vitamin E, which is also known as alpha tocopherol. There's actually a few different flavors of it, if you will, that are all terols and trinols. But alpha tocopherol is the most common one. Now, the way it works is, imagine this spherical boat that's the lipoprotein. Alpha tocopherol actually protrudes the monolayer. It sticks out to the hull side of the boat. And it's an antioxidant. But as you learn about these things, you find out antioxidants are kind of in their own way just controlled pro-oxidants. When it comes into contact with another reactive oxygen species, such as a free radical, then it turns both it and the free radical into a non-reactive product. So it's like they disarm. That's why they're called antioxidants, is they can help disarm oxidants. Now, why do they have this antioxidant on board? Well, it's been speculated for a long time it's to protect itself. The LDL particles protect their cargo and protect themselves from becoming oxidized by having alpha tocopherol on board. But it's one of the most active pools of alpha tocopherol in the bloodstream. And absent that alpha tocopherol in the bloodstream, the free radical isn't going to go anywhere. So it can, because this is how free radicals work, it can come into contact with anything. And with its unpaired electron, it can ultimately pull an electron from whatever surface it's at, such as like a cell, such as a cell wall, like the bilayer of a cell wall, and cause something known as a chain oxidative event. So what happens is it'll steal an electron, and that'll turn that molecule into a free radical, which will then in turn steal another electron until it terminates. It has to terminate at something that's going to accomplish evening the playing field, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Well, which would I rather have happen? Would I rather my LDL particle come into contact with that free radical first, or that free radical come into contact with the cell wall and possibly cause a chain oxidative? Well, of course, I would rather come into contact with the LDL particle. And because it's constantly described as though it's its own defense, it disregards the fact that there's so many LDL particles already in the bloodstream that provide that constant state of contact. And that's why I think, but it's hypothetical, I think that this could be part of the story as to why it is very low levels of LDL often correlate with higher levels of cancer in many cases. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be also some cancers that can result in lower LDL, but they have observed this, particularly in other ways in which you compromise the immune response. You find that people have greater susceptibility to cancer. Let me give you just a quick example. Let's say you get an organ transplant. Part of the protocol for getting an organ transplant is you're often on immune suppressants. And this is so that you can receive this organ, so that your own immune response won't reject it as easily. But those same people are more susceptible to getting cancer. This appears to be in response to having to take immune suppressants. Well, so to what degree LDL particles are part of the immune response is important. I've only mentioned the antioxidants, but there are many other ways. For example, they bind to pathogens. They can also remove something called quorum sensing that bacteria use. And so there's many different ways in which they can impact in a positive way toward the immune response that doesn't typically get a lot of attention. Let me just fit in one more thing. One of my favorite studies is, I believe they did this with mice. I may have to find it, but it was with lipopolysaccharides, if I'm not mistaken. And they took a group of normal lipid level mice, as in they were just at normal lipid levels. And then they took some that were hyperlipidemic. They had hypercholesterolemia. They were called knockout mice, where they actually knock out the receptor that takes down the LDL particles. And they injected both with equal amounts of lipopolysaccharide, which is, for intents and purposes, something that's going to need a good immune response to deal with. In the control group, 5% of them survived. In the knockout mice, the ones that were hyperlipidemic, 100% of them survived, all of them.
Wow.
Every single one. And again, mouse study, take it with a grain of salt, but this is just one of those areas in which LDL particles are very relevant. Another one, just to fit it in real quick, I know I'm fitting in a lot in one statement, but another one, because I just get excited about this, is your peripheral tissues can also endocytose LDL particles, that's to say, engulf them. They have receptors that mediate the pulling them into the cell. And that's good because the cell's walls, that bilayer, is made of phospholipids and free cholesterol, which, by the way, is what these lipoproteins are made of. They're made also of phospholipids and free cholesterol. And I believe this is why you can see a drop in LDL particles common for people who are like heavy bodybuilders, because I believe their muscle tissue for growth and repair are doing a greater amount of endocytosing of LDL particles for that very purpose.
So that is a lot, and I think this is basically a primer into lipidology and the explanation around why the LDLs may stick around in the bloodstream for a little longer from an engineering and systems perspective. I think is important. It's important for everyone to understand, especially if you're the type of person who gets those shocking blood results from your doctor and you're trying to figure out what to do. So we basically talked about how, one reason that there would be LDL sticking around for a while would be from an antioxidant perspective. Another reason would be because it's taken up by all the different tissues for probably a whole variety of reasons to kind of help keep the whole body healthy. Maybe specifically talking about the antioxidant features and functionality of LDL. Why is that important? You mentioned there was a reaction that could potentially damage the vascular system. What is the problem with having these free radicals floating around in the bloodstream?
Well, I I always think of free radicals as kind of like our closest corollary to antimatter because they have the potential of damaging almost everything.
Hmm.
So our bodies are very proactive about trying to disarm them or relieve them of their capability. Now, I should emphasize something. To some degree, we also use them. Uh, Again, there's sort of the interplay between what is really pro-oxidant versus the bad guy version of a of oxidative stress. Let me kind of go. Let me kind of put it this way. So you've heard of hormesis, where effectively you get not a full dose of the poison, but
Right.
if you will, a small enough dose of the poison that it actually has a net benefit overall. There's some degree with which that's going on with us, especially with reactive oxygen species. There's some amount in which we naturally produce, in which our immune cells use for things like oxidative bursts. But there is certainly a degree with which the dose definitely does make the poison. You've got too much oxidative stress, and now our body is having to really mount a very serious immune response to it. And this comes into play with things like sepsis, for example, in which you're really seeing an overload. Well, so getting this back to LDL particles, I feel like there's not enough interest that's played into conducting the experiments like the one I just mentioned from earlier. And it's also why I really want to emphasize that I became very fixated, really going back to day one from learning about this. From a systems perspective, whenever you're looking at something that was built, you're trying to understand all of the trade offs made because you always are making them in engineering. And one of those was in trying to look at a particular outcome, such as cardiovascular disease, and how much cardiovascular disease is entirely anomalous, if it is, and why we should avoid that endpoint in particular through the process of lowering LDL. Because I can say this, if you have a genetic disease, a good example is PCSK9 loss of function, you will have less cardiovascular disease outcomes by having PCSK9, which seems to make the case that because it's associated with far lower levels of LDL, that you would be lucky to get it. But here's the catch. Those people with PCSK9 loss of function do not live longer. They don't actually have a reduced amount of what's known as all-cause mortality.
Hmm.
And so I have an analogy that I use a lot to try to illustrate this, which is think of a hospital. Like, let's say you have a hospital down the street. It's a great hospital. It's fantastic. But you know this. You know, anytime you go to that hospital and you get treated, there is a risk that they will make an error. And if they make an error, something bad can happen. When there is something you can do about it, you can just not go to that hospital. You could always try to take care of any injury or sickness or illness that you have on yourself, and then you won't have a problem that you could say is technically hospital error related. Okay, now let's change that and say, what if we abolished all hospitals in your state? Well, you could say, yeah, your state's rate of hospital related death or hospital related injury just plummeted, right? It's gone. But that's not the number you're going to be interested in. You're going to be interested in what's the actual outcomes. Are there people taking care of themselves easier enough than what the amount of hospital error rate is? Well, I definitely think that a myocardial infarction, like a heart attack, especially if you're building a plaque and it breaks loose and so forth, if that process was coming from atherosclerosis looks like the bad guy for sure. But my question is atherosclerosis at every stage the bad guy? Is the buildup of plaque in any way ever a trade-off? And that takes me back to the hospital analogy. The easy way to know is if all-cause mortality went down after you abolished all hospitals. Because if it did, that does suggest that the hospitals were the problem.
So maybe talk a little bit about how the effects, the positive effects of having free radicals in our body, because it's very applicable to what's going on right now. with COVID-19 and immune responses. So I'm curious to kind of maybe merge those two conversations together if you have any thoughts there.
Well, of course, this plays out in immunology all the time. That's quite literally the functional basis of vaccines with regard to you're wanting to create a situation where your adaptive immune response can learn what the enemy is before having to face it in mass. So if you can have a little bit of the enemy, and of course, a modern vaccine is trying to get even the sort of dead and inactive parts to be detected, and then for your immune cells to learn about it and then be able to mount a response for when the active version comes around. That's certainly a very powerful means of perpetuating greater immune response in advance of it happening. And this is where certainly one of the biggest technological advances we've ever had was infection was one of the biggest problems, arguably the biggest problem for most of our existence until really about 80, 90 years ago. And then heart disease became our biggest problem and still is. It's the biggest problem in the world. But in that regard, yeah, there's many things that play out this way. Another good example, kind of related, is exercise itself. So if you go and work out right now, you will inflame yourself. You will up your oxidative stress. That's absolutely expected, and your body should be more than adept to deal with it. But you can't take that too far. You can overexercise. Not only could you bring up your oxidative stress to less manageable levels for your immune response, you can also prevent it from having the night cycle for healing it. And that becomes a big deal. That becomes something that can make it that much worse. But should you have some exercise? Like, even if some exercise brings around some amount of oxidative stress, well, of course you should, for sure.
So I think following up on that, let's talk a little bit about oxidative stress and inflammation, because that gets talked a lot about in popular blogs and health and wellness material. What is that, and what's going on, and following our analogy earlier, what is that used for good, and then how can that go awry?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because this is one of my pet peeves. Is I find inflammation gets a bad rap. Inflammation is, in fact, a built-in part of the body to dealing with injurious stimuli, you could say. And we would die without it. If we didn't have the inflammatory response built into our body, we would die. So you twist your ankle, for example, and you see that there's some swelling, there's some heat, there's some pain. All of those are built right into the tissue, ready to go at the moment that it happens. There's something called mast cells. You probably heard of histamines. They release histamines. And a lot of chemical processes come into play. And one of the things that happens, for example, is your endothelial cells, the cells that line your vessel walls, they, in response to these chemicals, will start to separate from each other and start to pool blood into that area. And that's why there's the swelling. But this is a good thing, because part of what they're doing is that they're calling upon immune cells to come to the area of injury and get to work. They're the emergency workers in your body. And yeah, you have pain. You're not supposed to move it or manipulate it in any way. There's some work getting done there, right? And this is true inflammation. But inflammation could just as easily be called the healing process. What happens is we often paint it as the bad guy because so many people suffer from chronic inflammation. Well, the engineer in me says, okay, do you really want to tape over your check engine lights? Do you, if your car is making a funky sound, do you just want to get better about ignoring it? Try to put something over the engine so it muffles out the loud sounds. No, like, again, you should be aware if you have something like chronic inflammation, you probably have a root cause that you need to deal with. It's true. Inflammation itself can be a problem, and this is usually in the case of something like autoimmune diseases. But the vast majority of inflammation that's happening is happening due to a problem that you hope is transient. But if it's not transient, especially if it's coming from diet, it's within your power to do something about it. And you should. Like, you should look for what it is that is the root cause. That's why I myself, I'm not a fan of anti-inflammatory effects that I think, if I can, I would try to just muscle through. If I can white knuckle it, if I can deal with the pain, I'm going to, because I would rather not inhibit the immune response from initiating that inflammation.
So coming back to LDL cholesterol then, because that's obviously received a lot of attention since, like you said, almost 100 years ago, the advent of heart disease becoming a significant issue. And we've talked about how LDL sticking around in the body for a little while can be potentially beneficial because of its antioxidant properties. It's delivering different cargo, as we talked about. How does understandably the mainstream science, the mainstream medical community is thinking about two things. It's thinking about lowering LDL cholesterol, and it's thinking about lowering inflammation. And so, from my understanding, there are a series of drugs that do those two things. And you talked earlier about PCSK9, and PCSK9 inhibitors, from my understanding, are becoming an extremely popular drug along with statins. Do you want to talk a little bit about this sort of suite of drugs from an engineering, from a here's why they're so popular perspective? Because I think from a basic education standpoint, in this conversation, we've probably lost a lot of people, but that's all right. They're learning. So maybe from an education standpoint, maybe talk about thematically why the medical community is so aggressive at prescribing these drugs.
Sure. Well, to be fair, I'm always careful when I'm walking this line because I don't have any public position as to whether somebody should or shouldn't take these drugs. They should make that decision with their doctor.
Absolutely.
What often comes up is people will ask my opinion on it, and I say it's not so much that I do or do not like the drugs themselves. It's more that I have a problem with the data, and particularly the means by which we get the data. So you mentioned PCSK9 inhibitors. Technically, for as low as they can get your LDL in conjunction with statins, because they can get it into like the 20s and 30s, which is insanely super low. It's surprising that they do not have a more substantial effect than you'd think they would. That you would think that they would have, particularly on mortality and especially all-cause mortality. Now, the issue that I have, and the reason why this is just sort of a problem with drug studies in general, is that drug studies are not going to take data to market for a drug that's not, something they can sell. So, of course, every trial that happens for which they successfully lower LDL, but do not lower mortality, that's never going to make it to market. And that data, even though it does show a lowering of LDL, in spite of not having the outcome of expectation, that data is disregarded generally because it's considered to be a failed drug trial. So it wasn't the lowering of LDL; it was the problem with the drug itself. So that was the problem. Whereas if a drug trial does have any lowering of LDL and has some benefit, even if it's just on cardiovascular disease mortality and not even all-cause mortality, that then gets added to the typical meta-analyses to make the case for it. Now, even so, there are still trials that have made it that don't show a benefit in mortality, particularly for major vascular events-based mortality. And those still get left out of a lot of these meta-analyses. In fact, one of the most recent ones from like 2007, I think it had like 25 trials, much of them before the regulation changes in 2004. But it left out like 11 major trials, including Aurora. Aurora is a trial where they saw like virtually no benefit at all for those people that were on the medication. And they usually find specific things about each trial that they would conclude to be a reason to leave it out. And that's why I say it's just that the data is not as interesting to me because it's a very competitive atmosphere when it comes to um, making these drug trials and making use of them. And I don't blame business for that. Business does what business does. But the problem is that that data is very proprietary relative to the data. Like I like to get a hold of epidemiological or genetic data because it tends to be a lot more shared and it tends to be a lot more accessible. Statin trial data, for example, you're never going to get a hold of it. The one place that has the greatest amount of access to statin trial data is the CTT, which is based out of Oxford, and they effectively have a legal monopoly on all of the data, virtually all of the trialist data, and they release meta-analyses. All of the meta-analyses are 100% positive at all times. Like it's there that website. For one time, just for the heck of it, I went through the website to see if there was any kind of article, anything that even suggested anything potentially negative, given all the data that they have, even though many people have asked if they would do meta-analyses on negative side effects for some of these drugs. And it's just, and that's what, again, I don't blame businesses for acting as businesses should and do. It's just if all of the data we're going to get on cholesterol lowering medication comes from industry sponsored studies, there's what can we expect? We can expect that's just going to be more likely the outcome. Again, not saying that it's a conspiracy or anything along those lines, just that I would like the data a lot more if there were more trials that were run that had no industry sponsorship at all. To the best of my knowledge, I think there's only one. I think it's all hat, but that's what I know thus far.
So most people I know over the age of 50 are on a statin. Just from an information standpoint, what mechanistically are statins doing?
So they're blocking something known as the HMG co-reductase portion of the pathway of cholesterol production. So in inhibiting the production of cholesterol, this accomplishes two things. One, it accomplishes less cholesterol in the blood. And in part, a good reason for this is because less cholesterol is being made in the liver to make those initial boats, those VLDLs I was talking about, because you need to have a certain amount of cholesterol as a constituent component to building the boats. Think of it as kind of like a spare tire on a car. It's not going to leave the manufacturer until it has all the parts it needs to just be road safe. And so the spare tire has got to be on it before it's going to put it out on the road. Well, there's a certain amount of cholesterol payload that's got to be on every lipoprotein before it can be secreted by a hepatocyte, by a liver cell. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, there's going to end up being less that's in the blood. But again, I'm going to continually tie this back around to it. Everything comes back to all-cause mortality. If I wanted to not, here's a better way of putting it. If I wanted to not die of a cardiovascular event and to instead die of something else, then I would take steps to lower my LDL as much as possible. I would be on a high carb, low fat diet. I would be on a statin, PCSK9, on ezetimibe, I think it's called. Every way I could think of to bring my LDL down as low as I could. And then the chance that I die of a heart attack has now decreased substantially. But that's exactly equivalent to my saying the chance that I die of something that's not a heart attack has increased substantially. We don't care about the exact what it is that you die of as much as we care about the when. The when is the all-cause mortality. Yeah. That's why I use the hospital analogy. If you were afraid of dying in a hospital, there's a surefire way to keep from dying in a hospital. Don't go to a hospital. But did that keep you alive longer than it had you gone to a hospital? That's the question you're really interested in, right?
So for those that are not familiar, again, from an education standpoint, and then I want to get on to kind of what you've been up to lately. But the reason why having these LDLs float around in the bloodstream has been noted as problematic is because they build up into these plaques. There's sort of lots of LDLs in these plaques that are then creating different types of of heart disease implications and cardiac events. Is there anything else that you want to say with regard to just in general, why historically has there been so much attention paid to it? And is there anything about the overall heart disease conversation you want to just add in here before we move on to other things?
No, let me add on to that because I think I can capstone this a little bit. Certainly cholesterol, when looked at in isolation, has a loose correlation with cardiovascular disease. And that is taken as what is commonly known as the lipid hypothesis to mean it must therefore be the driver. Now, simple science, the first question I would always ask is, does it meet what's known as the Bradford-Hill criteria? Which, not to get super geeky, but it's actually a really great series of assessments to look at to determine if something has causality. And very quickly, you learn of two that are of a special importance. One is consistency, that's one of the assessments. And the other is specificity, which is another one of the assessments. And so in short, there shouldn't be any group of people that has substantially high LDL cholesterol, but do not have likewise high levels of cardiovascular disease at a population level. And that's part of why I'm in the process of putting together a study on those people who are on a low-carb diet, who, like me, have seen their cholesterol go up substantially and are technically in the 99th percentile for the population. By all rights, we should be seeing a higher rate of cardiovascular disease in this population. If we don't, then it does open this door that there is at least more to the context than the simple lipid hypothesis that high LDL drives the disease, period. And I think that's the big takeaway I really want to give to everybody. It's not that I'm pushing back that LDL-A doesn't drive heart disease. It's very well possible that it does. My first question is, does it in the context of a low-carb, high-fat diet? Is it possible that it's higher for a reason unrelated to what it's normally associated with? Because I think LDL can be high for bad reasons, such as if you are chronically inflamed, part of the inflammatory response, for example, is a release of cytokines that can drive LDL production. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that can create that further association, and we should disentangle that from this other side of the ledger, which is, hey, maybe LDL is higher just as, you may be using your vehicle more for a reason that doesn't have to do with going to the hospital. You might be using it more to go to concerts. And you want to disentangle the two to know which association is worth which. And that's why we're trying to do the study to further elucidate this, to better find this out ourselves.
Yeah, oh, that's helpful. And I think for me personally, I've noticed my LDL-C skyrockets when I fast for more than 28, 48 hours. Mechanistically, why is that? To tie it up.
That's the inversion pattern. I was just describing that earlier. So what's happening? You're not eating the chylomicrons, which disappear right away. You're instead releasing more fat from your fat cells, which ultimately drive a greater amount of production in your liver to put that stored fat into VLDLs. And therefore, you end up with more VLDLs in circulation, which are rapidly releasing that fat-based energy to your tissues and remodeling to LDLs. And that's why you'll see the higher LDL-C. And that's the conversion, or I should say that's inverse to those people doing the Feldman protocol where they're eating a lot of fat. So their fat storage doesn't have to get released, doesn't have to drive more VLDL, and therefore their VLDL drops, and therefore there's less successive LDL.
Got it. And we haven't touched on HDL very much, but maybe just very briefly, do you want to talk about how that's involved in this overall picture?
Yeah, so of course, HDL cholesterol, the so-called happy cholesterol, that's cholesterol found in another kind of lipoprotein known as a high-density lipoprotein. And yes, it tends to be associated with lower cardiovascular disease risk the higher it goes. As you probably saw, and certainly I've seen, my HDL is the highest it's ever been since going on a low-carb diet. But I believe that this also fits into the energy model that's kind of my larger hypothesis, in that you tend to see HDL go up when there's a greater catabolism of VLDLs, that is, a greater use of the VLDLs, particularly in their dropping off their cargo. I won't get into the technicals of it, but a lot of this takes place at the liver. And this can result in a higher level of HDL cholesterol. Now, How much of that is very specific to the benefit of cardiovascular disease risk? Can't say yet. This is also another reason why you want to have that association study. If you were to go strictly by those numbers, then the trade-off looks great because HDL has typically a much stronger, particularly HDL and triglycerides together, have a much stronger association when both are optimal to cardiovascular disease benefit than LDL does to cardiovascular disease risk.
Okay, this is helpful. I mean, from a basic education standpoint, I think the audience has gotten a crash course in all things lipidology. Let's maybe take a slight aside and talk about the pandemic, talk about the science of immune responses, potentially having LDL around. Maybe just more generally speaking, is there data showing that having more LDL around is potentially beneficial? I mean, I know you referred to a few in the mouse study earlier, but is there more data around how it plays a role in immune, and how could that be related to COVID-19?
Well, I've been begging and pleading on social media for them to do the following study, and it's not been done yet. What I want is for them to just simply look at, there's a lot of countries like Sweden and the UK where they have large registries of data, so they can do this pretty easily. I want them to look at annual lipid labs from people before they got infected, and then look at what those labs are and what their correlation is with people after they've gotten infected and what the severity of the disease outcome was. So in other words, would people with typically higher levels of LDL, especially if they have this triad that I'm interested in, which is all three, high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. If you have that triad, what is the resulting outcome that we tend to see with the severity of the infection with COVID-19? And unfortunately, it's not been done yet. Now, there have been studies that have shown what happens to your lipids during the infection. And there is an association with lower levels of LDL and worse outcomes of severity for COVID-19. But I want to be cautious when I mention this because that could just be what you'd call reverse causation. It could be that actually the lower LDL is as a result of the severity of the infection, not the driver of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I think that's helpful from an overall backdrop. So let's come back to your story. So you started running experiments on yourself. You started positing these hypotheses. Where have your journey over the last 5+ years, you said, where has that journey taken you, and what are you up to? What are you up to now?
Yeah, so that's one part of the story. We sort of went into the education part. We didn't talk about as much what happened since those 5 years ago. The reason why I've developed a lot of the, what I call the lipid energy model that I have now, it really comes from experiments I've done with myself. I've done a rapid succession of blood draws against different kinds of food plans and situations that I've set up. And I get a bit meticulous about it. For example, there's an experiment I just completed that was 15 days long, and I'll describe it in detail. Effectively, I have a maintenance level of what is my keto diet. And I call it the baseline diet. It's not especially interesting, but it was chosen so that I could continually revisit that specific diet to confirm the baseline blood work every time I do a new experiment to see if anything changed. It's really just 3 ingredients. It's Nathan's all beef hot dogs, Colby Jack cheese, and hard-boiled eggs. And that's it. It's, again, not going to win any awards, but I take that in addition to a multivitamin, some calcium supplements, and some electrolytes. And then what I did in this last experiment is I ate 5 days straight exactly the same meal for 10 a.m., actually this time around it was 9 a.m., 2 p.m., and 7 p.m. And I eat at exactly the same times to at least try to reduce the confounder of the possibility, whether it's going to turn out to be true or not, that eating at different variable times might have an effect. So it's like Groundhog Day. Each day is identical as I can make it for 5 days straight. That was phase one. I then go into the phlebotomist and I get my blood drawn. And this time around, I got my blood drawn at LabCorp. And then I further got a second blood draw that I iced myself and shipped to Boston Heart. So that was phase one. Then for the next 5 days, I ate everything exactly the same, except exactly in half. So what I ate at 9 a.m. was half of what I ate for the last 5 days. Same for 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. and repeated those 5 days exactly as is with nothing else changing. Then took another wide spectrum blood test at the end of that phase. And then for the third and final phase, it was a hypercaloric. So maintenance level for the first phase, hypocaloric, the phase I just described, and then hypercaloric, where actually I ramp up the amount of cheese and eggs and hot dogs that I consumed. I also had to add a fat shake because I can't just ramp up only that food. But after 5 days of that, I then do a final wide spectrum blood test. The reason I was doing this was twofold. One, I was going to do an exact replication. This is actually an exact day-for-day replication of an experiment that I did last year in April called the OX-LDL experiment. I was mainly interested in this one assay called oxidized LDL, which we were kind of just talking about. If your LDL particles become oxidized, often it's because they've ran low on that alpha-tocopherol. They've ran low on their vitamin E. And that's why they tend to find an association with high levels of ox-LDL and atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in the arteries. Is with a highly oxidative stress environment, you're going to have bigger problems. Yeah. So this time around, I not only wanted to repeat that experiment verbatim, but there's now this other test, and I can't really talk about this without getting a little bit geeky, so bear with me for just a moment. Right. It's an oxidized phospholipid test. So the LDL particles, that's the boat. If they're oxidized or not, though, that test that I did last year, it's a pass or fail. Either there's some oxidation or there's a lot of oxidation. Either way, it's counted. So think of cars on the road. You're counting them whether they have a scratch on them or whether they're totally smashed up and totaled. And what I like about the oxidized phospholipid is it makes a distinction. It says, no, we're going to count the pieces of the hull of the boat, which are phospholipids themselves, and each one of them that gets oxidized. That's the gist of this particular test. And I believe that is one of the most powerful tests that I've been excited for this test for years. I speculated before it even existed. And now that it finally was existing, I talked to my Boston rep and I was like, can I be in the beta for this? Can I just test this thing? And no, I couldn't get it until it's commercially available. Well, it just became commercially available. So I was willing to redo the entire experiment I did from last year entirely. Not only get all of the same tests and ox-LDL, but I was going to get oxidized phospholipid and I was going to get a battery of other tests from Boston Heart. And so it's going to be a treasure trove of data like I've never seen before. I'm really excited about it, including a lot of things I don't normally get, like wide spectrum thyroid and a whole bunch of other stuff. The big question is, why would I do this? Well, A, because I'm testing hypotheses I have that I post before I actually get the data, which incidentally, I wish we did more in science. It's one of the things that's been kind of upsetting to me, right? Which we can get into separately. But seriously, I do wish that more science was conducted where what you're hypothesizing, what your endpoints of interest are stated plainly before they get there, as opposed to when you get the data and then try to make it exciting after the fact. But then, yes, I wanted to get this data and I wanted to compare it also with the ox-LDL from last year, since that was pretty exciting data. And I want to see how it compares with that, but also having this new oxidized phospholipid, it's going to be really good data. It's rolling in right now, but it's not all here yet.
So 5 days of baseline, 5 days with not much food, and then 5 days with a ton of food. In summary, what were your hypotheses?
So first, the inversion pattern is going to show up. I would bet on that. My LDL, whatever it is in the first 5 days, will go up as my food and my fat went down. And then for the last 5 days, it'll go down as my food went up. That I feel confident about. I believe the oxidized LDL will actually track with it because that assay has a problem in that it's pass failed. So it's just going to track with LDL particle count. But the oxidized phospholipid, I hypothesized for really long before I even designed this experiment. I've hypothesized it should still be in healthy territory if the assay works correctly. It should show that in spite of having huge high levels of LDL and LDL particle count, that my oxidized phospholipids themselves, that count will be low because I believe it will more accurately reflect the real marker of concern.
So I know for me personally, and a lot of people out there, when you're doing low fat diets or low carb diets and high fat, a lot of us are trying to basically do the best of both worlds, right? We're trying to keep our inflammation down, and we're trying to keep our LDL down because our LDL-C because our doctors want that down. And so a combination of exercise, and I remember myself playing around with the differences between saturated fat and omega-3s, omega-6s, omega-9s to try to tweak that number. I'm curious for your own experimentation, and I know you've run a number of these experiments over the years. One, what would you say to the person who's trying to do the best of both worlds, in quotes, to get their inflammation down and LDL down? And what have you seen from your own experiments and thinking around that whole conversation?
Well, I certainly think if you're interested in bringing your LDL down, it's my first piece of advice is just swap out fat calories and swap in carb calories. You'll track, and my perspective is laid out by the model. You're now trafficking glucose more, and you're trafficking fat less. And less trafficking of fat means less boats that traffic it around, therefore less of the payload of cholesterol that shows up on those boats. So if that's what you're looking to do, then that's a great way to do it. Inflammation should almost be looked at separately because while I know it's commonly stated that LDL particles drive inflammation, I have yet to see any evidence of that in real world data, particularly in the people that I know who have sky high. I mean,
yeah,
you have to understand, I know people who have levels of LDL that are in, I think I even ran an informal poll. I probably know something in the neighborhood of around 25 people with an LDL of 600 or higher. And I encourage them to get wide spectrum tests because they're unicorns as far as we're concerned in that people usually have LDL that high, do usually have high levels of inflammation, because it often is downstream as a result from the things that I say are typically the bad association for high LDL. But a lot of them that I know have, for example, HSCRP under 1, have excellent glycase, have excellent IL-6 and TNF alpha. All of these would expect would be sky high. LDL independently drove the process of inflammation. Now, want to be a good scientist? It's possible it manifests at some later time and there's sort of a lag effect. But that would run counter to what we already see with people who have the genetic disease of familial hypercholesterolemia, where they have high levels of LDL from birth. For example, somebody with homozygous FH, one of the children that got Brown and Goldstein going, they're the research scientists who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the LDL receptor. The child had homozygous FH and had tendon xanthomas at age 3. Those are like fatty deposits in the extremities, like it was on her knees and so on and so forth. And she had developed a stable angina at age 3. And she had her first MI, myocardial infarction. She had her first heart attack at age 6. Now, in theory, these, as you know, I call them lean mass hyperresponders. That's the phenotype, where they have very, very high LDL from going on a low-carb diet, but also typically have very high HDL and very low triglycerides. In theory, they should be likewise developing these symptoms just as rapidly as those people with likewise levels who have homozygous FH. But I speculate that No, it's a very different context. There are genetic abnormalities with people who have FH. And I even brought this up in a recent debate where I was pointing to a paper that shows quite literally having that LDL receptor binding mutation means more than just there being higher LDL. It means even their own immune cells can't utilize the LDL particles, which, getting back to what I was talking about earlier, is relevant to the immune response. I'm interested in any and all data for which high LDL, particularly if due to being fat adapted in a healthy vascular system, demonstrates a higher rate of cardiovascular disease. And it's not to say that the data won't manifest. It's just that I haven't seen it.
So I've noticed with regard to separating inflammation from the cholesterol conversation, I've noticed that having more carbs in my diet raises inflammation. Do you also see that? And is that what mechanistically is going on there?
So I think it depends on the person for sure. I think there are some people who tolerate carbs well. I know some who I think their blood work looks great. I will say this though, for example, there are some in my family, particularly on my dad's side, who have gone low carb, have functionally cured their type 2 diabetes, at least in that, A1C is low, blood sugar is low, and so forth. And they are hypersensitive to carbs. And they may not have started that way at, say, age 12.
Right.
But as of right now, and this, by the way, includes me, like I'll see this in my numbers if I do these, because I'll do experiments where I include carbs or I'm doing carb swapping and so forth. And I can observe these changes in markers that I would prefer I didn't get. If look, like I said, inflammation is the process of healing, but at the same time, it's also an excellent marker to watch for. This is why I like C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein is a super, super highly sensitive marker. And granted, you can get false positives because let's say you work out like crazy the day before you get a test, your CRP is going to be high. It's understandable why it's high. You just did that. But let's say that you didn't. Let's say you didn't exercise, you didn't do anything. You go and you get a test, and you only could get one inflammatory test. C-reactive protein, if it's low, it's a pretty strong indicator there's no inflammation of any significance that's going on, beyond something that's like very local. Or if there's some genetic abnormality that results in it, pretty decent chance you could bet on it that way. And it's good because if you have the inflammatory process in play, it suggests there's some reason your body needs to heal, and that it's in the process of doing it now. And it's not that you don't want it to heal. You do. It's that you should be concerned if you see that it's constantly doing so. It suggests there's a problem.
So I remember when we talked a year or so ago, you brought up this amazing analogy with LDL of almost like taking those little those foam packaging popcorn things and then pouring it over your head. Can you talk about? Can you explain that analogy a little bit? Because I remember that it was extremely impactful for my understanding around how, from a size, from a relative impact perspective in our bloodstream, that LDL works.
Yeah, so this is something I had to do early on because it was just driving me nuts. I always get this explanation. It's described this way, that these LDL particles, they're like BBs coming from a BB gun. They're just smacking hard into your cells, and they're pushing through your cells into the subendothelial space behind, creating the plaque. And I had to sit down and just work out the math because I learned that the size of an LDL particle is around 22.3 nanometers. And 22.3, remember this, because the bilayer of a cell wall is around 10 nanometers, right? Roughly. Well, that's a cell wall. On top of that, you have the cytoplasm underneath, all of the organelles, and the cytoskeleton. And then you have the bilayer on the other side of it. So when you figure out the mass of what the LDL particle is, in order for it to get to the other side of an endothelial cell, it would have to penetrate the bilayer, go through the cytoplasm, all of that, smash through the other side, in spite of how incredibly light it is, relative to just the mass of the bilayer itself. Almost nothing just permeates that bilayer that was, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get geeky again here too. There's a whole bunch of considerations with polarity too. There's actually a lot of, I'll just say there's a lot of electrical aspects that create a further permeability. There's also something called, I think it's fourth state water, where technically water as we know it occupies three states: the ice and the liquid and the gas. But there's technically a fourth state where it kind of bunches up and becomes gel-like. That's also a barrier, as is also the glycocalyx, which is sort of, you could almost call it like the fur that sits on the endothelial wall. All of this leads me to feel more confident than I've ever had before that the way by which LDL particles, there may be some uncontrolled way in which they get from one end of an endothelial cell to the other, but it's not by smashing through them. I feel so confident in that I would bet my house. There are only two ways that I know of where an LDL particle can move from the lumen, that's the space, in the bloodstream, to the other side of an LDL particle. One is in the controlled way in which it's receptor mediated. Sorry, I'm totally geeking out here, but I'm just going to roll this out.
To the other side of the endothelial cell. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a process known as transcytosis. So LDL receptors, and really there are other kinds of receptors, but basically receptors, as in the cell controls this. Receptors get a hold of it, they bind to it, and then they invaginate it into a vesicle. And then through a control process, move it to the other side. That happens, by the way, all the time. There's transcytosis happening constantly. In fact, there's more LDL particles in that subendothelial space than there is in the lumen per, I think, concentration level. But we see this in vitro studies. You can transcytose LDL particles all day long. And then there's one other way, the only other way I know that we induce LDL particles getting to the other side in an uncontrolled fashion, and I literally just talked about it, which was through the process of inflammation. If you have a site of inflammation, and if you have endothelial cells separating from each other, then now the gap is big enough. Because that gap, without separating from each other, is smaller than the size of LDL particles. And even then, it's kind of like a zipper. It has lots of different proteins connecting between the two. I don't believe for a second that that's just slipping through from the laminar, from the shear stress and so forth, without there being something like a site of inflammation where now the endothelial cells, by design, separate. And the reason they separate is so that a monocell can differentiate into a macrophage. That's where the macrophages, those immune cells in the lumen, they're coming over, and then they enter into that crevice, and like an amoeba, they kind of get into the other side, and now they can start like swallowing up stuff, right? Those are the only two ways I've seen it physically demonstrated in a way that we can induce LDL particles getting into the other side. Now, I should give a quick shout out to Paul Mason and Ivor Cummins, who are very interested in Subotan's work, who will say it's actually from the outside in. That's coming from something known as the vasovassorum. Again, I'm so sorry to everybody who I've just like geeked a whole bunch of terminology at you for, but the bottom line is this, getting back to what your question that brought me into this. Bottom line is this, I have a tough time imagining LDL particles smashing through. I use this analogy. It'd be about as likely, I think, as taking one of those foam beans that are in packing material in a box and like pouring it on me. I think it's as likely as one of those like penetrating through my body and getting to the other side. I just do not see that physically taking place once you figure out the math on it. And let me just fit in one more thing too. A lot of people even go to the extent, and I did too before I figured out the math on it. I was like, how much of my actual blood volume is literally cholesterol, or at least these boats carrying cholesterol relative to everything else? Can my blood actually get thick with cholesterol? And I sat down and I figured out the math, and I found studies that go into the cubic nanometers of LDL particles and multiplied it by the sheer numbers that we have them in, which is ridiculously high. They're measured in something known as quintillions, which is a million trillions. A million trillions, which is a lot. But in spite of that, they're so small that if you figure out their cubic cubic nanometers relative to the total volume of the blood, you find out it's about 1/4000th to have 1,000 nanometers of LDL particles. So in other words, even if you had, say, 4,000 LDL particles, nanomoles of LDL particles, and I'm talking really huge amounts, it would be like 10% of 1% of your total blood volume for 5 liters for a human male.
That perspective is extremely important. Yeah,
Tiny.
And so for those on our earlier conversation, for those unfamiliar, why the controversy and why it's important for us to be aware of the LDL particles getting on the other side of the endothelium. Why do we care about that?
We care about that because that's part of the hypothesis, the lipid hypothesis, as it were, that the more LDL you have in your bloodstream, and not just the cholesterol, but the boats that carry the cholesterol, the more they're going to drive the process of atherosclerosis, because they are, as would be explained, lipid hypothesis, they're at a gradient level. They're pushing their way into the subendothelial space. And the more modern version of this hypothesis is they're getting stuck. They get stuck there. They attach to something known as proteoglycans. They get oxidized, and then they start initiating the inflammatory process. And then from the way they describe it, it is in perpetuity. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. You can't stop it. Now, I'm gonna give my opinion, total hypothesis.
Sure.
I think everything that I've seen about LDL particles suggests that they are constantly recruited to an extent to where I almost think of them, LDL particles themselves, after being remodeled, as almost a pseudo immune cell themselves. The macrophages seem to be making use of them in a way, from my perspective, that makes a lot of sense. Since they bind to pathogens, since they carry the antioxidants, it seems like it would make sense for endothelial cells to even transcytose them into an area of interest. Like if there was bacteria or viral loads or anything along those lines that could in any way be impacted, it's kind of like the airbag effect. Why not pack those things into that space, right? Now, where this will probably get controversial, but shouldn't be, is we already can observe that plaques can be regressed, particularly in the earliest stages of something known as hemostasis. And these macrophages that go and swallow them up, they don't just always sit there. They're supposed to swallow them up and move them out. What a true plaque foam cell is it's got a necrotic core. It's got macrophages that have swallowed cholesterol and have died.
Right.
That's an important part of the story, because the engineer in me goes, wait a sec, why? Why did the immune cell die? And the regular story that's always told right now is because they just can't help themselves. They consume until they get overfull and then they die. And I don't think that's the complete story at all. I think that there's a lot more to the story. And using the hospital analogy, I think that as you would see with a hospital, let's say that hospital down the street is still there. Let's say now you add a catastrophe. Let's say that there's a tornado that hits, and then there's an earthquake, and then there's, a meteor that drops. And guess what? The hospital is still a hospital. It's still going to try to take every patient it can. But the hospital error rate goes up. Would you blame the hospital for its hospital error rate going up? I mean, you could. Would it keep you from going to the hospital? It might keep you from going to the hospital if there's a point at which you feel their error rate is exceeding the benefit you could get from going to the hospital. I think that that analogy will ultimately apply to both cholesterol and macrophages and these foam cells. Because as you mentioned earlier, you can get things like lower atherosclerosis by doing things such as inhibiting the immune response. And they've done this. They've done this, for example, with knockout mice and scavenger receptors. But guess what? You get more death. You get less atherosclerosis, more death. So I don't think you can disentangle the immune part of this story with either LDL particles or, for that matter, atherosclerosis itself.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, obviously, anyone listening in has to have a long conversation with very well qualified medical professionals. But those medical professionals that are investigating this type of data, that are curious about the types of experiments that you're running, I think are the types of medical professionals we should be looking for as individuals, for sure. So we've camped a lot on LDL, the education around lipidology, and I think it's important. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because many of us have found that changing our diet away from the standard American diet has changed our lives. We feel better. We're more fit. Our workouts are better. We have more energy throughout the day. Our brain function. Like, there's so many benefits of doing this. But heart disease is the number one killer. LDL cholesterol has been in the literature, and a lot of studies around the association between LDLs in these plaques and the complications from heart disease. So, in summary, your overall advice to somebody who this is their concern, they're wondering what to do. I know a lot of this conversation has probably gone over some of the heads of some of the audience, but the audiences are ambitious people that I think will appreciate it. What is your overall suggestion from an information transfer purpose that you say to this audience?
I sort of feel like, generally speaking, many of my cohorts in engineering, we are more likely to start over from scratch. Just about anything we're very interested in learning. So you have a plumber come to the house and they tell you a whole bunch of things, and there seems to just be some information that doesn't jive with your initial instincts. And so what do? We go, all right, well, I may call you to come back, but let me just do a little of my own homework. And that's just how we function. That's also sort of just the entrepreneurial spirit. There's a lack of trust in larger systems. But that doesn't mean that the lack of trust is appropriate. Sometimes, larger institutions, larger systems, they're right about things. But what I do find is, for those people who are they're going to struggle a lot with feeling as if they're moving against a mainstream axiom, like LDL cholesterol causes heart disease. For those people, I say you really should strongly consider, finding where your comfort zone is and moving to that comfort zone. It's how you're built, and there's nothing wrong with that. On top of that, I could be wrong. I'm cautiously optimistic, as I like to say, cautiously optimistic that high LDL, for the purpose of it being seemingly metabolically induced, is not only neutral, but might even be beneficial. It's possible. But I could also be wrong. That's why I say cautiously optimistic. There's another group of people that are going to be like me. They're going to be more experimental. They tend to find different things about what's being told to them, which they feel that there's less focus on the issues with the core argument, and then try to find out more information for themselves. And those people I might take more time to make the case with if they seem to be very interested in hearing it out, which is why I do things like this. But at the end of the day, I always say the same thing to just about everybody, whichever way I think they're leaning, which is hear out both sides. Listen to the mainstream opinion, hear out the case that they can make. If you can, listen to this other view and where it is that I'm coming from. Check out the energy model. Check out where I've been able to stratify risk looking at this triad: high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. And I will leave you with this one thing on that note, which is I've had a long-standing challenge that's now 2.5 years old. You may already know about it, the low-carb cholesterol challenge, where I'm looking for anybody who can actually straight up submit to me a study showing high LDL does associate with high cardiovascular disease risk, where coupled with high HDL and low triglycerides. And as of yet, I've not been able to find any study. In fact, every study I've been able to find shows the opposite. That if you have high LDL alongside high HDL and low triglycerides, you have a low risk for cardiovascular disease. Again, doesn't mean the study isn't out there. Could be, just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. And so for those kind of following along, doing the math, just mechanistically, why, in hyper-responder phenotypes, why are trigs low? You think that if there's a lot of fat flying around, why wouldn't trigs be high?
Because usage is up, full stop. So why if you go to a harbor where there's a lot of trading ships, are you going to find most of the ships are empty? Why would you go to, say, a FedEx facility and find that shelves are more empty than they are full, given fast turnaround, because of the fast turnaround? So I have one more analogy that I think really kind of illustrates this well, which is, as you said, triglycerides being in the blood, high triglycerides tend to be a marker of cardiovascular disease risk. Well, let's go back to the boats, and let's imagine you and I are standing above a harbor. And in that harbor, we see a whole bunch of boats. And in this example, I'm gonna play the question guy. I'm gonna go, wait a sec, why is there 100 boats here? That's way too many boats. And you'd say, well, hold on, Dave, let's see what happens. And what we watch is we're watching these boats coming and going. And we find that the ones that are leaving with cargo, they're coming back empty. You go, well, actually, Dave, I think they're just meeting the demand of wherever it is that they're dropping off their cargo. So we leave for a year, and then we come back, and then there's 1,000 boats. And I go, oh no, there's 1,000. That's definitely too. Come on, you said 100 boats is fine. That's maybe fine, but 1,000 boats, that's way too many boats. You go, now hold on, Dave, hold on. Let's watch. Sure enough, we're watching, and 10 times as many boats are going out, and 10 times as many boats are coming back, and they're empty. You say, I think they're just meeting the demand, right? That's because the turnover on the cargo is just higher. But now, let's change it one more time, and let's say instead, there's no boats going out. They're all full of cargo. They're all bouncing against each other in the harbor. Is that a bad sign? Yes, that's a bad sign. Does it matter if it's 100 boats or 1,000 boats? Doesn't matter.
Right.
There's a failure to succeed at dropping off the cargo. And I believe a lot of what we're seeing with people who have high triglycerides demonstrating the risk is a metabolic dysregulation or a major inflammatory event. I think those two major categories explain why we would see so much triglyceride parked in the blood persistently, is because it's failing. It's failing to do its job of having the boats drop off that fat-based energy. So yeah, I know people with LDL, the same people I was just mentioning, LDL is, let's say, 600, but yet triglycerides of 70. You cannot find in the existing NHANES data set anybody who looks anything like that. They might as well be unicorns. But I believe they are demonstrating the energy model. They're demonstrating a fast and rapid turnover of fat-based energy in tissues.
Yeah. So there's two things you've talked about or hinted at in this conversation that I think are extremely interesting and compelling. One, the fact that LDL particles may be carried in a receptor-mediated endocytosis or transcytosis fashion into the sites of inflammation where these plaques might be. So it sounds like you're hinting at that you have a hypothesis that may be done on purpose for a anti-inflammatory or an immune response purpose to try to heal that plaque. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think it's part of the existing, and again, it's a hypothesis, but I think it's part of the existing containment strategy that we already see in many other respects with immune cells in general. Immune cells, the more you learn about them, often called phagocytes, they phagocytose, as in they engulf stuff. Yeah. And then they have acid baths they apply to them that's inside their cells, right? So how great is it that you can have a helper that's in huge supply, much bigger supply than the macrophages themselves, that are constantly coming around and binding to pathogens, kind of like, sticky balls, giant sticky balls that you can hit something that's much smaller and have it contained, right? Have it at least slow it down or hold it into that subendothelial space. And I realize this is very controversial because what I am effectively saying is I believe endothelial cells are participants in the immune response, that they themselves, with receptors such as scavenger receptors, the same scavenger receptors you have on macrophages. Scavenger receptors are by definition something that binds to a pathogen, a problem particle, right? But they're on endothelial cells. I believe that they are intentionally getting a hold of them because endothelial cells themselves are helping to take them out of circulation. If they can, you want to have a controlled process of disarming them, not an uncontrolled process. And so it makes perfect, again, it's the engineer in me. I'm looking at the receptors right there in the family phenotype and the genotypes that they describe. And I'm seeing the processes that they're showing in the in vitro studies. I'm seeing, for example, damaged endothelial cells will transcribe more LDL receptors. Why would they do that? Why would endothelial cells that get damaged both transcribe and express more endothelial cells? There's an in vitro study where they did a sheet of endothelial cells and they protruded a hole in the middle, and the endothelial cells around the hole, at the edges of the hole, would express more LDL receptors. Why do you suppose they do that? I think that there are two obvious reasons that I would want to see ruled out before I would think of something else. One is because, hey, if we're going to gestate more cells, you need more cell membranes, therefore you need more phospholipids and free cholesterol, which you can get from the Home Depot packages that are practically flying by you in the bloodstream, right? And the other is potentially because you need to triage more of those LDL particles to the area of interest, which might be relevant in this regard. And that's why, it makes sense to me because monocytes cannot easily attack things that are in the bloodstream. But as a macrophage, they can when they help immobilize them more in the subendothelial space. So anyway, yes, yeah. I think LDL particles are very much a part of this. I think that's why you can get less atherosclerosis by inhibiting them. But is that a positive trade-off? I want to see that data. I want to see data showing. That's why, the very first thing I did when I started up this research is I went straight to find if people who have genetically lower levels of LDL just live longer. Because they should, if that's all you needed to do. If having a PCSK9 loss of function or anything else that results in low LDL took out the cardiovascular disease risk factor without a trade-off, you should have a longer living population. But it's just not the case.
So you said with regard to the second part and reason why that the LDLs might be recruited, you said we're to be triaged. Triaged for what? Triaged for potentially this harvaging, this reactive oxygen species harvesting, or what are they would be triaged for?
I think that there may turn out to be a trade-off benefit to moving the LDL particles at a higher degree into the subendothelial space of a site of interest, such as a site of inflammation. I think there may be a benefit that we'll ultimately discover, or may have discovered, and it's just in studies I haven't yet looked at, but I've already observed many of the mechanisms that bring that to bear. Let me give you an example of something I would do if I ran my own lab right now. We've already gotten pretty geeky, so I'm just going to jump into it.
Do it.
I would want to do in vitro studies on macrophages, where I take healthy macrophages, and they've already done versions of this, but not the one I want to do, where they experiment with exposing them to atherogenic LDL particles, as in the ones that are modified. They've been oxidized or glycated or so forth, and macrophages are very attracted to that. They'll engulf them quickly. They won't engulf LDL particles that are unmodified as quickly. You could think of them as not high up on the menu. And that makes sense because they're focusing as immune cells on the problem elements, right? What I would do is I would have one group of macrophages that had only the modified LDL particles. And I do another group that had the combination of both modified LDL particles and unmodified LDL particles. And my hypothesis is that second group would do better, because I think they make use of those unmodified LDL particles. But again, this is not normally the direction in which they steer the research, because they start from the assumption that it is pathogenic overall, full stop.
So then the two big meta points here is that it's very possible that the LDLs are actually, one, recruited on purpose, two, might actually have a healing component to them. And I think that avenue of research from a scientific perspective is absolutely fascinating and should definitely be explored, given how huge of an issue, obviously, heart disease is. So then the second point then, it seems that there's at least some agreement, is that inflammation is causing damage, right? To use how do these LDLs even get in? You said in sites of inflammation damage where they're separated, LDLs are getting in. What's causing that inflammation damage? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think for us to approach this conversation, we really need to understand that.
Well, the best way to state it is what's causing the inflammation. What's causing the inflammatory response might be a better way of stating it. So if I took a nail and stabbed your hand, that's going to become a site of inflammation everywhere throughout where I've damaged tissue. Again, it's like a good way of thinking of it for the average person is it's sort of like a break glass, pull lever kind of thing. All cells have that. They have chemicals built in for when there's a problem that they then break the glass and pull the lever, and then they start to send them out. Cytokines are the most common one. It's a signaling molecule for help. Help, there's a problem. There's a problem here. And cytokines are a way by which, at a local level, immune cells can detect the cytokines. They're looking for them, right? And I'm only speaking of one category of those signalers, by the way.
Hmm.
But then on top of that, cytokines at a large enough quantity will then start activating production changes, such as at the liver. The liver will get enough cytokines, and again, one of the things it'll produce more of potentially is greater ApoB-containing lipoproteins, or VLDLs and LDLs and so forth, right? So yes, creating that which results in the inflammatory response, there's a huge list. There's lots of things you can do. You can have an inflammatory response to an infection. You can have an inflammatory response. Of course, there's just a straight up injury. There are various things that's going to have that result. But you want to think about it in terms of the inflammation isn't so much inflammation can definitely result in damage, but inflammation is part of the process of healing for the same reason that, you might break bones on purpose in order to better fix them.
So given the architecture that you set up earlier about the endothelium, what is causing the damage in all those coronary arteries, for example? That's eliciting this response? What's even causing that damage?
My hypothesis is A, it's a long list. B, we already know a big portion of it. For example, smoking clearly causes a flooding of reactive oxygen species, clearly causes greater atherosclerosis. Smoking is one of the best ways to get a heart attack if that's what you're interested in doing, right? But on top of that, there are other means of inhalation that can bring about something like that. But where this gets a little more interesting is in a lot of the places where, and we're kind of seeing some of this data emerging with COVID-19, is that there may be ways in which the infections themselves make you especially susceptible, and possibly that one can develop more atherosclerosis. To be fair, this is very emergent.
Yeah.
The data is still very preliminary, and so by no means am I making any claims here, but it's fascinating how many different things can result in the damage that cause the inflammatory response. I believe a lot of the story of atherosclerosis comes less from how the damage is done, because damage is happening all the time to our vascular system. It's more to do with the inhibition of the repair. I believe atherosclerosis is a lot of how you can keep from the reversal occurring. And so beyond just preventing the means by which the base level of atherosclerosis happens in the first place, on top of that, you can do something like, say, I think you can get yourself into a state of hyperinsulinemia. You're eating around the clock. You've got your insulin level super high. That's preventing the night cycle of repair. Your body needs to have lower levels of insulin. A good example is HDL. HDL particles can be more bioactive when insulin is low. And it's why a lot of sickness leaves you with little appetite. It's kind of a systemic way your body's saying, hey, cut out the whole GI tract part of it, take insulin out of the mix, let us control this at a more minute level.
Hmm. Yeah, and I know a question I get a lot, and something that I've noticed in my own experiments on myself, is the electrolyte and water flow, and just the feeling of when I have a lot of carbs that there's just a lot of inflammation and water mass around there, and when I go on a high fat low carb diet, there is a lot of a release of water, and electrolyte imbalances tend to become an issue. What's going on there? This is a common question in the keto world, but what's going on there mechanistically, and how should people be thinking about that?
So it's funny you mention this. I can't speak a lot to electrolyte, I guess you could say science as much, but I can't say it's been my single biggest struggle. Me personally, since going keto, it's the one thing that I found. I keep being like Charlie Brown in the football with Lucy, in that I keep thinking I've got the electrolyte thing tackled, and I don't. And I keep coming to the same solution over and over and over again. In fact, it's funny. Today, I'm getting it in the mail. I keep coming to, as much as I want it to be something esoteric, like it needs to be just the right amount of potassium, just the right magnesium, it almost always comes back to salt. Full stop. I just need to have more salt.
Yeah.
And so I'm now getting just straight up salt tablets. And I'm going to rule in or rule out over the next few weeks, whether it's just that, because I'm going to be taking a lot of it. What I find is, for me, if I get electrolyte depleted, I can get to a point in which it's very hard to come back from it. It takes like days for me to come back to it. And I'll even be serious about drinking like salt water and a whole bunch of other stuff at higher levels. What I find is that actually I need to go a step further and just prevent it from coming up in the first place. And again, I've tried a lot of different sports salts, different electrolyte drinks. I even have one to the side right now, and it's a little bit more heavy on the potassium and magnesium. But this last experiment that I just did, one of the earliest data points that came back was that both my sodium and my chloride were below reference range during the hypocaloric phase. Now, that's very meaningful because your intake isn't what's going to show up in your blood work. Your body actually keeps to a very tight delta under normal conditions for a lot of your minerals. And so for it to be below reference range, I had to be pretty depleted. And that makes sense because I was having a lot of leg cramps through this experiment. And that's usually a leading indicator that it's about to get a lot worse if I don't do something about it.
Yeah.
Well, so what can I do? I just have to add more salt. And for what it's worth, I don't know about you, I find that I crave salt more, or let me put it this way, I tolerate salt more on my food at higher quantities when I'm very keto. So I'll have a burger that just looks like it's frosted with salt. It's crazy.
Yeah. And mechanistically, why? Like, everyone talks about the keto flu and talks about how you got to get tons of salt. But what's going on there? Is it something to do with less insulin flying around? Is it something to do with lower blood sugar?
This one's much more outside my wheelhouse. And for what it's worth, I've asked a lot of people this same question. The most I hear is just that it's on keto, we don't retain water as much. So we flush out electrolytes a lot faster. But I do wonder how much of it is mechanistic.
Yeah.
From a cofactor requirement standpoint. But again, it's not normally a space.
We know that glycogen stores a ton of water when glycogen stores are full, right? And so when you're dumping glycogen, which is done in ketogenic dieting, it will dump a ton of water. That's the classic, 5 to 10 pounds, depending on your weight, of water weight that you just lose is probably from mostly liver, but to some degree muscle glycogen. right?
Yeah, but that's kind of more of a one-shot thing. It's not
Right,
like you're constantly replenishing glycogen and then dumping it again.
right.
So
So yeah, no, curious to learn more. So anyway, so for the investors, entrepreneurs, people that are obviously have learned a lot about, even in this conversation, about immunology and lipidology in particular. What advice do you have to them? So for entrepreneurs that are thinking about things, about what to do, investors that are thinking about how to invest in this space, obviously when you talk about problems in the startup community, heart disease is the arguably the hugest problem you can think of. What advice would you have for these people?
well, at a minimum, I would say start looking at the right targets. I think even if you don't buy into, uh, I think even if you're not skeptical of LDL, you should at a minimum be aware of what the top biggest risk factors are. You may not have known until this conversation that much about HDL and triglycerides, but let me tell you, I've been all over the place with it, and the data is very strong that if your HDL is low, your triglycerides are high, you have something known as atherogenic dyslipidemia, and it is far more correlated with heart disease than LDL is. But it's often overlooked by doctors themselves. It was overlooked by my doctor and my dad and my sister's doctors before they got a lot more keto savvy doctors. And the literature is right there. It's been around for a few decades now, but it's not focused on as much because it's hard to treat HDL and triglycerides. So they kind of don't put as much focus on it, but it's a much bigger risk. So if you're somebody who's, as you mentioned, if you're somebody who's already an investor, you're already doing a lot of cost benefit day in and day out. Trust me on this one. You want to pay attention to HDL, to triglycerides, and for that matter, you should pay attention to the other three that make up what's known as metabolic syndrome, which is waist to hip ratio. Of course, we should try to keep that gut down. Blood pressure and fasting glucose, though I would say really fasting insulin. If anybody who is listening to this right now who hasn't gotten a fasting insulin test, please add that to your next blood work. You want to get fasting insulin and that other marker I mentioned, C-reactive protein. If it were my druthers, every basic blood panel would have those two markers, that fasting insulin and C-reactive protein, and you want them both really low.
So it sounds like there's a big call to action for us from an education standpoint, right? And I think from a startup perspective, there's probably a lot of opportunities just to educate not only the general community, but probably also the medical community, the clinicians that are in there day in and day out. And obviously there are barriers of entry when it comes to inventing and creating drugs. But what other advice would you have for people that want to get interested, want to help out, want to potentially create for-profit, nonprofit ventures? What kind of advice would you have for them?
Well, of course, I think that while I try to be pretty diet agnostic, certainly I think that there's a lot coming up in the lower carb space. And I think a lot of that's because there is, frankly, because there's such a propagation of diabetes and obesity. And many people are finding that they can maintain sustained losses in this context. Again, I'm cautious to even say that. I'm only saying it from an investor standpoint, not from an advocate of low carb in particular. But if I had a lot more money to play with, that's actually a space I would probably put a lot of investment in because I do feel like it's going to be around for a while, and I do feel like the popularity is going to continue to climb because I've observed it myself. You know how a lot of times when it comes to investing, you look at just what's actually happening in your own sphere. And my sister had tried so many different diets, like all of them. It's crazy. Just about any time a new diet got released, she had to be on the tour to doing it, and she would find the other friends who would be a part of it and so forth. This is the only one, and all the time she's been alive that I've seen her hold on to. It's kind of meaningful to me. I'm like, wow, it's pretty impressive. And same thing with my dad. My dad is the only person now on my dad's side of the family who has had such a drop in his A1C and is now off all of his medication from doing this. I mean, again, if you could think of it as like, oh, here's this pill you could take, And if you take this pill, you can be off all of these other pills. That would already be a super expensive pill. You know what I mean? That would already be a pill that would make a lot of money.
Right.
So I can understand why there's so many people in the space that are really kind of branching out into other business models that have to do with keto and have to do with education on it and so on and so forth. You may or may not have heard of Diet Doctor. Diet Doctor is it's kind of you can almost call it the hub, one of the biggest websites, arguably the biggest website for low carb. And their valuation is getting very impressive. I'll just put it that way. So,
yeah, both from I'm noticing myself and my group, we're watching both the education type plays as well as anyone who's getting involved with health tech surrounding the low carb, high fat community, and things that it touches around diabetes. Like I'm noticing more and more of the continuous glucose monitor companies coming out, more and more of the ketone meters and the ratio between the carbon dioxide and oxygen in your breath. Lots of new wearables, lots of new things coming into the space that are going to help inform us. So in the same way we have a million trackers on our car and indicators, we're going to probably have a bunch of bio data available for us that we can then feed into the algorithms that's going to help inform us how to live. So I'm seeing a lot of that coming onto the market, and that's probably a pretty good space to be playing right now.
Yeah, it's definitely something I love. I mean, I'm constantly wearing wearables and getting blood taken, and every morning I'm blowing into a BioSense to check my acetone along with my lipid markers and everything. So certainly it's something I'm looking forward to. I myself have had money to spend on it. I would 100% have made an insulin monitor by now, because I think being able to detect insulin's hard. Yeah. It's a hormone. It's very difficult to find enough parts per million in the blood, but I think it's going to, the point at which we can cheaply detect it and easily, it's going to truly change the world. Yeah. Because I think once we can actually see the area under the curve of insulin and how closely it correlates with diabetes, I think that's it. I think it'll be hard to deny the level of evidence that comes with it.
Well, Dave, really, really appreciate your time. I obviously have a million questions and we could keep going on forever, but where can people learn more about you and follow along with regard to your work?
Well, there's pretty much two major places, which is the website we run, cholesterolcode.com. And of course, I'm very active on Twitter, Dave Keto, Daveketo. If you're somebody who does go low carb and you see your cholesterol go up, you may also consider our Facebook groups. There's two. Just search for Cholesterol Code. That's our main group. But there's also, for those who have this phenotype for lean mass hyperresponders, you can do a search for that as well. And both groups are very active. They're very science-centric, which I love.
Awesome. I'll make sure to put links to all that in the show notes here. So anyway, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you for having me, Will.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about health science, emerging technology, software development, startups, and a variety of different topics that we talk about on this show. So you can visit wclittle.com and hit the subscribe button, or you can actually subscribe to specific topics that you care about most. Number two, I have a portfolio company with my partners and I at Proto Ventures called Startup Rocket. If you visit startuprocket.com, there, if you are spinning up a new venture, you can receive customized coaching for your business model and the vertical that you're tackling. And it's a place for you and your teammates and your advisors and your investors to be all on the same page to make sure that you're not missing anything as you go about the important entrepreneurial work that you're about to get yourself into, or that you have been into for quite some time. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're watching, you can listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. And if you're listening, you can visit wclittle.com to view the episodes and check out the show notes for following up in more detail for any of the topics that we talked about. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you watch or listen to this show, that would be super helpful, help get the word out, and helps other people consume and interact with this content. Thank you.